Yeah, there you go. Perfect. And there's a clicker there. All right.
Excellent.
Thanks,
Thank you
Olivia.
very much. Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. Real pleasure to be here. And it was a pleasure to have Bamsi coming up and to comment and dealing with Sharon and Eamon and the guys as part of the whole HOMEDEM thing. So it's delighted to be here. I might have a quick chat with some of the other PhD students, because some of the work you're doing I know is very closely aligned with some of our current work, and you'll see some of it popping up here today. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about goes back 10 years, and I'm looking at Suzanne Cahill and Maria Pierce here, two co-authors and real drivers, I suppose, of a lot of my first steps into looking at dementia-inclusive design. So in many ways, I have to really credit the two guys, because they were such experts in the area, and I was coming at it pretty fresh. A lot of universal design experience, a lot of designing for accessibility and so on. But it was with working with them, I think that really it clicked for me in many ways. I also think, certainly Suzanne, the way you spoke about dementia as a kind of a disability, also was something that really fitted with the kind of universal design approach, and took away some of the stigma. So I'm going to talk to you today about home, universal design, and dementia. And I'm going to deal with a number of kind of residential kind of settings, but I'm primarily focusing on mainstream housing, right? But then I will kind of move into a long-term care a little bit, and kind of looking at the kind of blurring of boundaries between them. And really looking at how a universal design approach can support the needs of people living at home, in the community, and in various kinds of settings. So there's kind of 5 areas that I'd like to address. First of all, kind of looking at the home, right? And housing as a critical part of the continuum of care. Then talk about dementia-inclusive design, residential environments, and the role of universal design, as I just talked about a moment ago. And then quickly about some new and converging challenges, some issues that are certainly affecting all of us, but having a particular impact on persons living with dementia, older persons and carers, and so on. And then looking at the wider spectrum of housing and the continuum of care, and how we start actually giving us an opportunity to start dealing with some of these new and converging challenges, and some of our more recent research work in that space, which is kind of really looking at this piece around resilience, from a climate change point of view, from a pandemic point of view, but also from resilience from a kind of a person point of view. And then to kind of finish up with some kind of future directions and opportunities. Firstly though, in terms of just looking at some of the issues we're facing, because we're talking about this continuum of care. We're talking about a continuum of care, a continuum of housing. I know you're trying to get rid of that thing on top, is it? Yeah. I think that it usually just goes away, doesn't it? Okay, hopefully it's not blocking too much. And you know, we unfortunately we are dealing with quite a lot of fragmentation and a kind of lack of coordination in terms of housing and in terms of this continuum of care. First of all, look, we have inadequate engagement and co-creation with older people, right? That's a real issue. And what's at play here? There's certainly ageism. I've experienced it myself working with design teams, when people will make remarks about designing certain environments for older people. And there are cultural challenges and expectations and so on around settings and environments for older people. Oh, there's an attitude, isn't it grand? Sure, it's fine. Or in particular, when you're working and co-designing with many older people, they'll be quite stoic, and they could be in the most horrendous of settings, and they're like, sure, it's lovely. Now they're usually talking about the people caring for them, their family members or their carers in a long-term setting or whatever it is, and that's kind of mixed up with the kind of built environment piece. So it's hard to extricate these. You know, we have many of our towns and our urban centres are unhealthy and inaccessible, and that certainly is an issue in terms of this continuity of care. We have a kind of a lack of joined up thinking between supported housing and long-term care models. We have a lack of engagement intergenerationally also, and this a siloed and age-segregated approach. There's a lack of community-driven models. Oftentimes it can be quite top-down. We have a lack of kind of grassroots, like cooperatives and so on, certainly in Ireland, providing interesting and innovative models in this space. And there's a lack of connected health services and community-based services. And when we start talking about housing, particularly when we start talking about housing and planning and at any kind of scale, and that kind of brings us on to this disconnect between spatial planning, housing and residential settings in particular. It's just not really an integrated part of thinking to date. In a previous life in architectural practice, I would have been involved in some local area plans or kind of wider or kind of planning development and so on. And on more than one occasion, when uses were being discussed on a site, and we all see that in development plans where, you know, yellow is housing, red is commercial, and many times there'd be a little awkward, odd-shaped site on the outskirts of town that nobody knew what to do with, and somebody would say, nursing home. And that was the level of consideration given. And then there's a lack of safe, accessible, active travel routes, right? And where they're actually in place, we're seeing them having a transformative effect. I mean, in parts of Dublin, we're seeing good cycling infrastructure, and now people are using trishaws to get to their doctor's appointment. They're using trishaws to go to the park, and we're seeing the opportunity for social enterprises, you know, like that to come into play. And then, of course, there's this kind of climate change and high energy costs, which are impacting people living at home and people living in kind of various settings. And all of this leading to poorer outcomes for older people, ill health, disability, and so on. So this fragmentation and lack of coordination being a serious issue. So, right, that's all the bad stuff. But when we consider home, and I think it's really important to kind of step back, because we can all go straight into the weeds when we're considering how we design housing, how we design any kind of setting, and we tend to forget the bigger picture. What is the actual home about? One of my favorite kind of writers in this space, Blunt and Dowling, and a very interesting book back in 2006, just called Home. They talk about it as a site, a place, right? Now that appeals to me as the architect, but then they talk about it's more than that. It's also an idea, an imagery that is filled with feelings. There may be feelings of belonging, desire, intimacy, but they're also honest enough to say that these can also be feelings of fear, violence, alienation. So home is this complex place. It's this kind of stage in which we live out the most kind of intimate and important parts of our lives. And a huge amount of work done around you know, the home and the meaning for older people, and living and aging in place and so on. So here we have Akland saying that living at home provides older adults with a sense of being anchored to their living community and a sense of individuality where they are able to decorate, alter their home, or fulfill valued roles and activities. And then they talk about possessions provoking memories and so on, right? So it's very much the same for all of us. Home is this really important aspect of our lives. But without doubt, as we get older, it takes on these additional and extra important layers. And also this piece about living in the community and remaining, you know, aging in place and in community, in your community, being really important. Well, there was the housing options for our aging population document, which came out in 2021. And I thought it was quite a powerful piece. It was finally a kind of an interdepartmental piece of work where the Department of Health, the Department of Environment, and others came together and started to look at, you know, what was required in terms of housing and aging. And there was some very strong policy pieces here. Now, if you look at all of the actions at the back of it, a lot of them, of course, aren't fulfilled, but it has provided a very good framework. And it certainly identified the really important role of housing and talked about good quality housing, providing a continuum of support and care across the life course. But this requires diversity of housing options. And of course, this is a big problem. We either have standard mainstream housing, which is not that supportive, not even for many of households, certainly not for persons with disability, and certainly not for many older persons who might be living with multiple challenges. So how would we provide this diversity? And part of that spectrum is the long-term residential care piece. And I think, you know, using this kind of continuum, this kind of spectrum, is a very useful way of thinking about it. And it doesn't kind of break things up into these kind of neat silos in housing, supported housing, and just you know, nursing homes, and that's it. We really need to be thinking about how these things are connected and how it's a continuum. So, you know, you're looking at this over on your left-hand side is mainstream housing, might have no specific inputs. Now, ideally, of course, that should be designed from a universal design point or an inclusive design point of view, and should be adaptable and flexible and allows it to cater for multiple needs and then evolve along with our needs. So that's ideal. But certainly as you move up along the kind of care levels, you might have home care services, you might have housing adaptations. And then when you're getting into the kind of supportive housing kind of area, you might have housing with low levels of support. And we see lots of examples around that. Lots of good exemplars in Ireland that are doing that job very well. And then you have supported housing at a higher level of support. And I think there's less good examples there. There's one that's about to open in a couple of weeks in Dublin, in Inchicore, and it's a pilot project between Dublin City Council, the government, and some housing associations. And that's very much aimed at providing at a high level of care for older persons to live in this environment until the end of their lives. So that we're starting to see that. And then that model, that high level of care model, starts to kind of move into the supported long-term care of the nursing homes. And certainly we're seeing a real blurring of the boundaries between that. And this is, I think, a really interesting space from a design and planning point of view. What we do in there and how we move this continuum, or we maintain this continuum and take out these kind of rigid breaks between this provision. The Housing for Older Persons policy piece had 6 principles that I often refer to because I think they're very useful and they provide a kind of a nice macro picture. There's the aging in place. We've just been talking about that in terms of the neighbourhood and so on. There's the using assistive technology, staying socially connected, working together, this kind of collaborative piece. How are we bringing, you know, the residents together with communities, with the private sector, with the third sector, with local government, and so on, to kind of create supportive and imaginative solutions. There's promoting sustainable housing and lifetime housing, and we will touch on this a little bit, the piece around the impact of climate change and the need for resilience and so on. And then really importantly, this piece around supporting urban renewal. I know it's similar in many countries around the world, but Ireland certainly has a huge issue with levels of dereliction and empty sites and so on, right within the hearts of our communities. So we're going around scratching our heads, wondering where we would put supported housing for older people, recognizing the fact that it should be integrated into community, and right in front of us, we're also worrying about urban renewal and urban regeneration and so on. So this is an obvious, you know, convergence between these two things. And it's part of the kind of opportunity piece here in many ways. Okay, so that's a bit of background where we talk about home, we talk about the importance of home, quickly looking at some of the kind of Irish kind of policy and so on in that area. And now let's come to kind of a really important piece of work that I started to mention right at the beginning, that we did with Suzanne and Maria, and so 2015, these were published, and they were the first, definitely first in Ireland, a national set of universal design guidelines, dementia-friendly dwellings for people with dementia, their families and carers. And a really critical piece about this, and again, it was experience and expertise of the two guys that really brought the understanding that to support a person with dementia at home, it's critical to support their carers and their supporters. So how does the environment also support the family? How does it support a carer? So this really emphasizes a universal design approach, which, you know, has that kind of broad, inclusive aspect to it. So you've probably been talking about this for the last couple of days, so I probably don't need to tell you, but if I was sitting in a room full of architects and developers and planners and people in the building industry, I would really be hammering home this message to them. Because sometimes there's a belief that, you know, this is a niche area. You know, do we really need to consider this in very wide terms? But we know that there are currently 64,000 people living with dementia in Ireland, set to double to more than double to 150,000 people by 2045. So that's a real need, and in many ways it's a very much an unmet need. And then critically, from the point of view of designing housing to cater for the needs of people with dementia, we know that most people with dementia live at home. 63% living at home in the community. 180,000 people are currently or have been carers, and many more providing support. So if we go back to what we're talking about, designing buildings and a built environment, not just for the people with dementia, but for their supporters and carers, suddenly this becomes a major concern. And also when we look at residential long-term care, we know that there's a really unreported level of dementia in long-term care settings. Suzanne, I'm quoting you here all the way back to 2010, some research that you did on settings in Dublin, which showed that up to 89% of the residents there had some form of cognitive impairment. And this is backed up then internationally. We see as a Polish countrywide a study that found 74%, and that was a conservative estimate, of residents in the nursing home studied across the country had some form of cognitive impairment. And I know when we go to long-term care settings, as part of our research, it is something that most managers and carers and so on will tell us, is that, you know, they're not recording. They don't know really how many people exactly in their setting, and there's a lot of undiagnosed people in these settings. So when we see this big need, right, and we see this large group of people with in many ways with unmet needs, and we look back again at some good policy in place, we have the National Positive Aging Strategy, which really talked about supporting people to live at home with confidence and security and dignity in their own homes. And then the National Dementia Strategy, which again, hard to believe that it's all the way back to 2014, talked about facilitating people to remain living in their own homes and to maintain the existing roles and relationships for as long as possible, supported by the wider community, along with primary, secondary, and community care services. So this is the continuum of care. This is the kind of ecosystem of care required. So as I just held up and pointed out, these guidelines were published in 2015. Now they were a kind of a sister or a daughter document to a set of universal design guidelines for all housing, right? That were published just the year before. But these were to provide specific guidance around in terms of designing for dementia. And we said at the time that if new dwellings or alterations to existing dwellings are built in line with a universal design dementia-friendly approach, then they will help people to remain living at home and in their community independently and safely for as long as possible. And again, reiterating this point, this approach will also support family members and carers to sustain the caring relationship. And that's particularly important if the carers themselves are older persons or they're persons with a disability. So how all the time thinking about how the environment, how these settings are also supporting the carer or the person providing support. To really understand and kind of lay out what these needs might be, and remember these guidelines were aimed at largely at built environment professionals, but planners and design professionals and so on. And of course, to support kind of allied health professionals, but it was very much aimed at people who wouldn't really have a huge sense of what these cares or these needs might be. So it was really important to break that down, and was really important in the guidelines and in the supported research document that went along with that to really understand these issues. And designers need to know what they're designing for. Right, that's a critical part of it, your design process. It's a critical part of the brief. So the guidelines and the overall approach takes account of a person that might have cognitive impairment, behavioral and psychological signs of stress, and oftentimes this might be in response to the environment. Is it too hot? Is there loud noises and so on? Might be dysfunction in activities of daily living, the kind of just dressing, cooking, the various aspects of it, like that. But also in terms of some of the kind of physical and sensory issues around mobility and gait disorders and so on, and stability while walking, muscular strength and strength loss and associated functional decline, visual and perception issues, which is a really important part in terms of designing and how you cater for that. Physical frailty, general mobility difficulties, increased risk of falls, partial or severe sight loss, hearing loss, and circadian rhythm difficulties and sleep disruption. I know one of you guys is doing some work in that space. But I mean, the home is a place that's a 24-hour facility. We're the kind of healthy sleep and providing the right conditions to support sleep are really important. So this is about providing a kind of fairly comprehensive picture of what the various challenges or various conditions that people might have living in these houses and how we might start to design for them. And then again, as I said, this was very much aimed at built environment design professionals and clients and developers and so on. And again, designers and architects and so on need design goals. You can tell them how to do something, or you can't ever tell them how to do anything, but you can give them good guidelines in how to design things. But it's really important to inform them about what the design goals should be, right? And this is what the overarching kind of desired outcomes. So rather than launching straight into a set of guidelines and recommendations and so on, it was really important to step back and say, well, why are you doing this? And provide a framework for that. And then, of course, each client and each site and each context would mean that the design brief goes much further. But here were the design guidelines we'd set out here: to encourage social connections and meaningful engagement with family, friends, and members of the local community, to reinforce familiarity and personal identity. And this is around the issue maybe of short-term memory loss, but retained longer memories. The personal identity piece around the potential loss of kind of selfhood or personhood in dementia, and how do we start designing for that, or how do we cater for that? Supporting meaningful activity, not just inane activities or something to amuse or just keep people busy, but real activities, the kind of chores around the house. How are we supporting that? And next to that, and this was one I can remember caused a little bit of consternation in some people, was promoting positive risk-taking. These are people living at home, right? They're going out and about and living their lives, yet there is, certainly from a design point of view, there is a well-intentioned in many ways temptation to remove all risk, to make the environment, foolproof. But that results in really restricting and curtailing a person and impacting on their rights. So we often saw issues of people, where gardens were closed off because they were deemed dangerous, or, stairs were considered, how is somebody going to be able to use their stairs and so on. So promoting positive risk-taking, of course, building the structures and making it as safe as possible, but allowing people to live their lives, which moves on to this point around promoting autonomy and choice. Enhancing self-esteem and confidence. So let's not design things that undermine people's confidence. And then ensuring the ethical use of assistive technology and so on were relevant, right? And in many ways, not undermining the importance of technology, but it can often be reached as a first solution to things. And it's a very important part of the overall solution, but we need to think beyond it. So, right, we've been talking about universal design. I've mentioned it right at the beginning, and we talked about the kind of multiple needs that a person would have. And if you think back to the slide where we were kind of breaking down the various needs from the cognitive to the sensory to the physical, you really need a very inclusive framework to encounter or to support a person who might have some of those challenges. Also bearing in mind that all of our needs change as we get older, and they change from a day-to-day basis, and that dementia is a progressive condition, so we can't just design for one state. So this kind of adaptability and flexibility is really vital. Universal design itself was probably written down and codified in many ways in the mid to late 80s in the US, but it has grown and become quite global. Chatting to yourself earlier on about, say, I would certainly look at some from Singapore to some good universal design guidance on housing and so on coming through in that space. So Edward Steinfeld, one of the early authors of universal design, talks about it as a process that enables and empowers a diverse population by improving human performance, health and wellness, and social participation. And we have it enshrined in the Irish Disability Act. We're one of the very few countries that have universal design so embedded in our legislation. So our 2005 Disability Act talks about universal design as the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, right? It's there, you can reach it, you can go into it and do whatever. Then understood, that it's intuitive, that cognitively you can get your head around it, and then finally that you can actually use it to the greatest extent possible, in the most independent and natural manner possible, in the widest range of situations, and without the need for adaptation, modification, or assistive technologies and so on, right? Now that doesn't rule out assistive technologies and technologies, of course, but what it means is that you should aim for something to work for everybody first, right? So it's like going up to a building with a set of steps and saying, oh, we have a ramp that we can put in place if you have a wheelchair, right? That's putting something in place to achieve access. We know that's not equitable, that's not practical. So that's what we mean by without the need for adaptation and modification. And of course, the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has universal design at its heart in many ways, and it provides a similar kind of definition. So for this work, and referring back to the universal design homes, which was a wider document that we were kind of supporting with the dementia friendly dwellings work, this had kind of four universal design principles that kind of shaped and informed the overall work. First of all, that the housing should be integrated into the neighborhood, right? So that's well located, that it's not distinct and somewhere to one side, that it's a very much part and parcel. It's stitched into the fabric of the community. That it's easy to approach, enter, and move about in, right? It's kind of back to the accessibility, the usability, the understanding, the access piece we talked about earlier on. That it's easy to understand, safe to use and manage, and that it's flexible, cost-effective, and adaptable over time. And again, really important piece around that flexibility and adaptability. But the first one here around integrated into the neighborhood, I think that's worth kind of stopping on for a minute, because that is a huge piece of this, and it's a huge piece of this continuum of care. So let's just unpack that for a moment. The neighborhood as a critical social and physical unit has been around since, or has been studied and examined from the late 19th century into the 20th century and up to now. And some very good documents over the years in this space. In the UK, they had the lifetime neighbourhoods, which was a companion piece to the Lifetime Homes, inclusive homes, across the range of abilities, disabilities, and age, and so on. And right up to now, we have the Happy Cities group in the US doing really good work, and a lot of their work originated with looking at kind of social infrastructure and so on in terms of inclusive cities. But they're, as a part of this, looking a lot now at kind of age and dementia inclusive neighbourhoods. So this neighbourhood piece being really important. And then in terms of international standards, a couple of years ago, this one over on the left came out here, this framework for dementia inclusive communities, which was an ISO standard and provided this kind of place-based and the kind of community and neighbourhood approach to creating a dementia inclusive community, not just built environment, but services and all the rest. So I would recommend having a look at that. Standards tend to be quite expensive, so you'll probably get it through your university or something like that. And then currently, there's one being developed around framework for smart intergenerational neighborhoods. So again, this piece around neighborhoods, and this, it is within the kind of aging societies section of the ISO, but it is also how you integrate older people into intergenerational communities. UN and UN Habitat talk about neighbourhoods are the building blocks of towns and cities, and people live most of their lives in their local neighbourhood. And for some, including children and older people, the neighbourhood takes on this additional significance. And then zooming in a little bit more to considering dementia, there's been a lot of work done in this space looking at how communities and how neighbourhoods as this kind of place-based approach play an active role in the lives of people with dementia, setting limits and constraints, but also offering significant opportunities, encompassing forms of help and support. Neighbourhoods as sites of social interaction, connection, and engagement, important sites of support for people with dementia. People living with dementia can be socially active in neighbourhood locations. A neighbourhood should be understood as relational places, not just fixed or unchanging, but something that we make and remake ourselves in many ways in our relationship with it. And then finally, the significance of the sense of belonging and attachment gained through kind of relationships with neighbourhoods, and this thing about being in place. So we can kind of flippantly enough talk about integrating housing into the community or into the neighbourhood and kind of move on from that important piece really straight away. But it is really important to kind of look at that wider piece of the neighbourhood. What's there? How can it support people? How is it part of this continuum of care? And how does it support this kind of ecosystem of support that's required? Okay, coming back to the dwelling. And we've outlined these 4 principles. And then when we start to kind of drill into the dwelling at its own scale, we had our design goals, which we talked about earlier on, which were very kind of all-encompassing. And we have our 4 kind of universal housing design principles. But it was really important for us to create a set of specific dementia-friendly housing issues that could kind of plug into the bigger universal design piece. And you can't see the top view, unfortunately, at the moment. Sharon, is there any way we can get rid of that little?
If that works.
Also, I shouldn't have so much graphics towards the edges of my slides either, to be fair. But
Try it again now.
it usually just goes away itself, doesn't it?
There you go. See?
Oh, yeah. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So there was 8 of these dementia-specific considerations that we were looking at. First was participatory design, and I'll talk about that. Familiar design, personalization, an environment that is easy to interpret and is calm, good visual access, unobtrusive safety measures and technology, distinct spaces, and safe and accessible outdoor spaces. Let's just run through these really quickly. You solve one problem, Clark. You're being really tested now.
No, no, you're right.
Super, yeah, brilliant, thank you. So the first one around encouraging a participatory design approach. This isn't just about being inclusive. This is about learning from residents. This is learning from family members about what we're designing, right? All the things we talked about earlier on, about the various kind of needs, about the complexity of conditions. You have to sit down with people and understand their needs and understand, really importantly, their lived experience. So if it's adapting an existing home, you can do it there. If it's a new home or they're moving somewhere else, then you can, talk about and consider previous places, and having family members and others as part of that participatory approach, really critical. And that helps then inform this next piece, this use of familiar design. Again, we talked earlier about potentially and possibly the kind of short-term memory loss, the loss of more recent memory, should I say, but the retaining of longer memories. And in this way, then using a familiar design approach and something that's recognizable to people is really important. And the next piece, consistent with user expectations. And I think that's an important thing for all of us. We've all stood in a fancy hotel or a bar or something in front of a mirrored wash hand basins and said to ourselves, where in the name of God are the taps? And you're literally like waving your hands around, you're hoping that something clicks in, because you've never dealt with this before. It's not how taps are typically designed. Now, I'm not saying we can't innovate, but a really good design is working with people's expectations. That is just some basic stuff. And it's really important in this context. Using personalization of the environment to enhance continuity of self. So how can we make sure that a person's environment reflects who they are as a person? And I think this is really important when people move on from their family home, so to speak, and into supported housing or long-term care or whatever, that we're allowing this personalization to continue. And the continuity of self, how is an environment reflecting somebody and reinforcing their identity? Providing an environment that is easy to interpret, calm, and paying close attention to the reduction of acoustic and visual disturbances. Again, looking back at the challenges and difficulties that a person with dementia might face. This might make them hypersensitive to environmental stimuli and so on. So how are we designing kind of calm spaces? I think it was maybe Mary Marshall or somebody, one of the kind of early pioneers in dementia design, talked about noise being to a person like a stairs is to a person in a wheelchair. And that really struck me because it really hammered home the point, the importance of acoustics and the importance of sound and so on. Providing good visual access to key areas of the dwelling or to important objects to remind and prompt an occupant when required. So we know that disorientation and visual issues might be part of living with dementia. So how are we creating legibility and clarity and good, tonal contrast and so on within the environment is really important. Providing unobtrusive safety measures and appropriate technology, such as assistive technology, ambient assisted living, telecare, and so on. It's a really evolving field. But making sure it's unobtrusive and that it's co-designed or designed in a participatory way with the person. What do they actually want? What will they actually need? And then this idea around creating distinct spaces for different domestic activities. So you're again reinforcing this legibility. Now that doesn't rule out open plan design and so on, because there are some benefits there. You have the clarity, you have the legibility, you have the visual access. But it is about maybe arranging furniture and interior design and so on to create a little bit of this kind of distinction. And then really importantly and really critically, the provision of accessible outdoor spaces that a person can safely use and that it's easy to reach from the interior and that it's also perceptible, that it's there. And again, we talked about promoting positive risk, and one of the continuous challenges is people being restricted from going out into their outdoor spaces, which are which is really detrimental to their health and well-being. Now, how do you kind of integrate that across these key spatial scales? We talked about continuum, how it's threaded throughout, how those design goals, how those key design issues, how universal design is this continuous kind of travel change, so to speak, throughout the key spatial scales is really critical. We don't only exist in one space at a time. We move, we travel, we circulate, we go out into the community, we come back, and we tend to kind of fragment things and design things well in isolation, but it's how they're connected is really critical. So how are we tying these things together? And again, the guidelines, that was a key aspect, that it really got into kind of threading the various spatial scales together. So it looked at home, location, and approach. Again, integration into community, right? We've talked about that. But things like careful design of external lighting, street furniture, ramps and stairs, access gates, and so on that make circulation safe and obvious. I love this photograph. I took it myself a couple of years ago, just down in Temple Bar, and I saw this lady with the rollator once or twice around there, and it just struck me that I'm not sure how close she lived to there. Now it's Temple Bar, so it's not exactly or the end of Temple Bar, so it's not exactly the kind of cheapest place in the world to live. But she was, a couple of times I saw her, she was just pottering around and looked quite content, but there was lots of things, wide footpaths. There was seating around the place, not too much traffic. It's a kind of a calm environment, and it struck me that it was a kind of an example of, if we provide supportive communities for people, and provide them with the opportunities to go out and about, it helps no end in terms of social interaction, physical activity, and so on. Then when we come down a scale and we're talking about entering and moving about the home, so this is where we approach the home. Now, it could be a block of apartments, it could be a single house, and a lot of the principles are still the same. And again, I was just struck, in many ways by this very accidental, I would imagine, front door in Dublin. It was a very distinct color. It was probably the most obvious on the street. It had planting to one side, and there was a little pot of lilac, and some other kind of flowers which were kind of distinct. So it struck me that visually it was clear and legible, and that there was probably kind of sensory things going on there for somebody as well in terms of the plants and the familiar aromas. So there's a number of senses kind of being hit here. But then when you get inside the home, in terms of key issues like we've just talked about the visual access, but the clearly defined spaces using distinct colors or tones, the clearly legible circulation that is clutter-free, a huge issue, I think, around, and a very simple thing around many people living at home with dementia is the amount of clutter that can be experienced in the home. Using kind of the familiar objects and personalizations in key locations, around the personalization piece, but also in terms of orientation and wayfinding. And then good views to the outside from both standing and seated position. Okay, that's just it's a good thing to have, but it also helps with kind of visual access into internal spaces, and helps with the kind of spatial and temporal orientation. Then we're looking at spaces for living, and we talked about the kind of balancing open plan layouts with more the kind of traditional kind of cellular approach, and key spaces in the home. And the diagram, or the kind of 3D image you see to one side there is a bedroom. And some of the key aspects here, like where you enter, if possible, extra wide doors, or they call them sometimes in the industry cat and kitten doors, which can be opened to allow, obviously, access in terms of wheelchairs or maybe moving furniture in and out, but also give that better visual access, providing direct views to a toilet, or at least a toilet door, to kind of prompt that, particularly at night. Potentially, if required, which is D, you can't quite see it there, but some glazing on the front of wardrobes so that, items of clothing and personal items can be maybe seen directly within the bedroom itself, and ideally from the bed. So a person's waking up, they're being reminded of, they need to get dressed, the toilet is there. And then again, back to this idea of good acoustic conditions from outside, but also internally, whether it's internal sources of noise, such as washing machines and machinery and so on, and between dwellings. And that's something that's where you have to go beyond your building regulations, because well, certainly in Ireland, the building regulations in that area are just absolute minimum. The last one on that slide was around access to external spaces, and gardens and so on. And this is a small garden we designed for Bloom a couple of years ago, 2018. Again, time flying by. And it was to demonstrate how a really small garden, this was like 8 meters by 5 meters, could be used to provide a hell of a lot of support for a person living at home. And you'll see the dwelling was to be, you see the writing says dwelling, that's where the house was. And it was key things like direct and easy and physical access to the space. The space was small and easily managed. There was furniture to support physical activity. We designed and built these kind of upright little tool sheds that people could see in, and there was handrails to hold on to. There was, small little covered areas that somebody could be by themselves, or they could be with others. But again, a good visual connection back to the house itself. It was calm and peaceful. There was lots of beautiful planting there with multi-sensory fragrant plants, and there was a use of color contrast. And then the kind of practical things like the non-slip. That was it there in Bloom when it was built. Now look, it's a garden festival, so the plants are all perfect and everything is absolutely ideal. But it really did give you a sense of what you could achieve in a really small space with pretty simple materials. And then you're looking at the kind of really drilling in a bit deeper here into the kind of elements and systems, the kind of the door handles, the furniture, the heating systems. But really sometimes that level of detail is really important, particularly when it comes to building materials and finishes and so on. And we had here some examples of on top, where you might have had traditionally, now you probably don't see this much anymore, but heavily patterned carpets, lack of color contrast between doors and walls and skirting boards, and some simple things that can be done, plainer, less kind of visually confusing floor finishes, eliminating thresholds between spaces where there's no clear kind of visual contrast, creating a stronger visual contrast between the doors and walls, and so on. So, again, very interior design stuff could largely be dealt with a few tints of paint, but can make a huge difference. And then, of course, there was issues here around distinct signage and internal environmental conditions. Pardon me. And I'll come to those in a minute because they're a really important part of kind of moving on. And then, the technology piece, and this here was again, what we covered was like, what kind of system can you provide in terms of providing this kind of, allowing people to live naturally in their home, promoting this kind of positive risk taking, but also providing the technology to help them. I mean, if you can have a gas shut-off valve that turns a gas oven off, do have it, if you can have an induction hob that's not hot to the touch when you take a pot off, then that just makes perfect sense. So there are obviously lots of pieces of technology that can be really useful. Okay, so I know there's a lot there, right? Kind of thrown and went through like about 2 years of work in terms of the guidelines, but I think might give you a good kind of snapshot of the key issues in terms of dementia, designing for at home for a person with dementia. But really quickly on the last, say, 5 minutes, just to highlight a couple of things, this kind of idea of some kind of new and converging challenges and things that we've certainly been encompassing or witnessing in the last couple of years, and that are really affecting older persons, but in particular persons with disabilities and cognitive impairments living at home and in long-term care conditions. We have, and believe it or not, it's happening in Ireland, but it's probably more of a problem for some of you guys living in other countries that experience more overheating, but we're definitely experiencing it a lot more, and we've come across it in our own research. Where high temperatures in residential environments are, in fact, it really impact on the health and well-being, and again, disproportionately affecting older persons. And the irony is that a lot of older buildings with a lot of heat loss actually perform a little bit better in terms of overheating because they've got thermal mass and they've got a draft. Whereas we're finding in particularly some of the nursing homes and long-term care settings that the newer buildings that are highly insulated and a lot of glazing, they're experiencing overheating. And then these may require additional ventilation, external shading devices, and so on. We're looking at kind of energy loss and kind of service loss to certain places. We had Storm Owen here a couple of months ago now at this stage, and particularly the West Coast and the South and West were really badly affected. And that was a newspaper headline where they talked about older people were confined to their beds for days, unable to heat their homes, prepare meals, or call for help. And that was the first time that Ireland, as an entire island, had a kind of a category red for the entire island. So it was kind of a new experience, and certainly it really impacted a lot of people. And then, of course, we've come through and in many ways still living with COVID, and that had a huge impact, particularly on long-term care settings, but also people living at home. And we know that the COVID had a particular high impact on persons living with dementia, but the secondary effects, the isolation, the stress, the lack of family contact, or breakdown in routines and so on had some really serious consequences. And, issues around a person restricting them or isolating them to a room were really, really difficult. So are we designing for these everyday challenges? First of all, such as flu, which can cause massive issues in a lot of long-term care settings, but also in our homes. Are we really thinking about that? Now, to really quickly kind of wrap up, because it's a way of kind of showing how some of these we can kind of converge around these things. Just a quick look at this kind of wider spectrum of housing and this continuum of care, and where we can, in many ways, start to look at accessibility, start to look at quality of life, start to look at climate, start to look at that overall resilience to kind of pandemic. And I'll skip that because unnecessary, but certain models of care. We have household models, which are smaller, they're usually kind of 12 residents. And these have been shown to improve quality of life, but they've also, some of the research has shown, performed better in terms of COVID. You had less people in that particular area, had less visitors coming and going. And we see plenty of successful models like that. So here's a model that starts to deal with quality of life, that may have positive, it may be positive in terms of pandemics and airborne infection and so on, and has positive issues in terms of climate resilience and so on. Some models, if we'd in Ireland a bit more time, we could run through them, but they'll be here on the slides. And then back to this kind of, going through these kind of scales. How are you? And this is in more supported housing and long-term care, which is a little bit more complex, but you're still applying the same kind of logic. And looking at this, bringing this convergence together, that, the proximity and integration in the community is an important part of a person's resilience. Walkable neighbourhoods have proven to have beneficial kind of climate and sustainability aspects, but also allow people, here we're back to my friend out walking in Temple Bar, also have these kind of social and kind of physical activity positive aspects. Back to the household model, we talked about smaller scale models that contain less than 12 residents. Again, co-benefits for various things like infection control, but also quality of life. And then issues like private bedrooms, which have long been preferred by many, in others cases for shared bedrooms. It's complicated, but they were certainly linked to improved infection control. The provision of external spaces. Many nursing homes and supported housing schemes have no access to outdoor spaces and upper floors, particularly in urban settings. And during COVID, this had a huge detrimental impact on people if they were confined to a room or a floor and that inability to go outside. Huge quality of life issue. And the odd place that did have them, and some places we visited, that was one down in Kinsale, who just happened to have a really nice roof garden on actually 2 different levels. And that was an absolute godsend for them during COVID. People could go out and socialize in a much safer environment. And then you're talking about the kind of some of the internal issues around ventilation, which again proved to be really critical in COVID. And it's now, in terms of heating and in terms of air quality and so on, becoming a critical issue in terms of resilience and climate change and so on. So to finish, there are some kind of convergences here that I think we really need to look at. Here, this is just showing the convergence between the quality of life stuff and improved infection control, right? The top, small scale living, working all the way down to air quality, ventilation, and so on. So we know that we can solve a number of problems and a number of challenges by thinking very holistically about these things. Expanding on our approach in terms of the built environment as a prosthetic kind of support for people with dementia, their families and carers. In other words, supporting their needs at that time and into the future. Design, architecture, and urbanism can start taking a kind of an upstream perspective. And we know there are a number of modifiable risk factors associated with dementia, and you can link some very directly, others a little bit less so, to design and the built environment. So how are we building and designing for brain health? Something that will protect and help provide a kind of a preventative measure into the future, while still obviously maintaining the kind of prosthetic or the kind of the directly supportive approach in terms of a dementia-friendly design. And then finally, we come back, right? So we talked about the fragmentation, we talked about the dislocation, we talked about the kind of the lack of connected thinking around housing across different kinds of scales in the community. So how do we consider housing and this care continuum? It's through inclusion, multi-generational, place-based, and connected approaches to our towns, villages, and neighbourhoods, right? In many ways, that's going back to kind of traditional ways of living in our urban environments, which was living in relatively dense, relatively mixed, diverse communities. But it's also considering this kind of spectrum and this continuum from housing, supported housing, respite, maybe daycare, long-term residential care, providing that kind of local shops, employments and amenities and so on in close proximity to where people are living, and also providing the kind of local education, health and childcare. So holistic kind of whole community approach. Only achieved if health and care policy fully recognise the role of the built environment in planning. Taking a place-based approach that leverages existing assets, right? We have so much of this stuff in place, and there are small breakages and kind of barriers to allow people to kind of go out and about into the community and avail of these services. A greater interaction between housing and residential care in the community, and as part of this continuum. A universal design approach to buildings, places, products, and services. Connecting care, climate, and biodiversity, and the built environment for sustainability and resilience. Bringing the idea of how if we're caring for our people, ourselves, our communities, and the planet, you know, how are we kind of connecting these thinking? Because it's, to be fair, it's very fragmented still. And then back to the kind of digital environments and so on. There is obviously a very strong place for technology, but we can't have a technology-led approach. It has to be a person-led approach and a place-led approach. And I think technology then has its role. Thank you very much. That was a lot of information thrown at you. And I'll just say at the end of these slides, there is kind of links to key information, to the guidelines and so on, and then some references to material. So, yeah, thanks.
Brilliant, Tom. Thank you. Yeah. I'll just stop sharing here. Thanks a million, Suzanne.